All right, well, I want to take us back to the history leading up to these stories, because in a way these stories are not only a perfect culmination of the Enlightenment, but a perfect culmination of an entire century of progress, manifested in Holmes's attitude and a picture of London that comes through in the Holmes stories. So I want to tell us a little bit about that. I realize I now have very little time left, but we'll continue this part of the story next time. So here's the basic idea. I've already talked about realism, so let me skip a couple of slides here about that and just jump to, yes, the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolutions. Here's the thing, and it's an important thing to understand, I think for us in our ordinary lives as well as in this course. The way that people live has been transformed dramatically over the last 200 years. If you were born in 1700, the way you lived would be probably pretty much the way people had lived a generation before, a century before, a millennium before. Really, human life did not change much from the advent of the Iron Age up to roughly 1700. People who more or less did the same things. Most people were involved in food production. They were farming. A few other people adopted skilled trades. Some were lucky enough to actually be part of the nobility or to be part of an intellectual class or a business class. But the fact is, 98% of the population was involved in farming. It was very hard to produce enough food for the people. And so, ordinarily, and outside of a few glimmerings of high cultural and high civilizational development, people were scraping by with barely more than what they really needed to survive. All of that changed in the 18th century. The agricultural revolution transformed farming in such a dramatic way that suddenly a small number of people were able to produce enough food for a large population. And that caused a fundamental change in the way human beings lived. Now what happened? Well, really, all of a sudden, you might say, starting around 1750 in Europe, but extending to other parts of the world, and you might argue really not until the last few decades, really reaching some parts of the world, there were changes in the way agriculture developed that meant that more food was produced at lower prices, with much less labor than had been the case before. What were the consequences of that? All of a sudden, there are lots of people who don't have to spend all their time farming and gathering food, but instead can do something else. And so it freed up labor for other kinds of human pursuits, at the same time that it gave people more money for other things. If food is that much less expensive, you have more money to spend on other kinds of goods. It also meant there was a large amount of capital available for investment as people pooled that extra money together. So it set up the conditions for the Industrial Revolution. Here you see some of the new techniques in farming, people actually spraying crops, for example, irrigating them, and also beginning to use fertilizers. You see systematic techniques of farming and crop rotation that enable the same land to produce many times as much grain or fruit or whatever it was. You saw new techniques of harvesting that greatly improved the efficiency of the harvest. And you saw people in general using the land much more intelligently, growing things that were much better adapted to their particular climate and land. So the result was a bounty of food in a way that had not existed at very many places or times throughout human history. Well, that transformation of farming in part depended on political stability that had not been there before. In a feudal system, if you have a really large and highly productive estate, what's going to happen to it? Some higher noble is going to seize it by force. And so in a way, it doesn't pay you to do a lot better than the people around you. They'll just steal what you have, legally or illegally. But a condition of stability through the government reforms instituted by John Locke and a variety of other people, the creation of a parliament in England, the transfer of power from nobility and monarchy to representative bodies of government, meant there was enough of a stable rule of law that it was possible for people to actually gain something from producing more. The result of all of that really was that in 1800, most people were connected in some way to food production. By 1900, most people were not. In fact, 20% of the people were involved in farming in 1900 as opposed to 80% in 1800. That's a dramatic change. 60% of the population was able to be transformed. Now, by the way, for these historical lectures, I want you to get the big ideas. Don't worry about, wait, 20%, 80%, 60%? I mean, that's not important. I want you to get big trends. I don't want you to worry about dates and numbers. But the idea is really this. A majority of the population moved from farms to cities during the 19th century. And that was a huge change in the way human beings lived. There were all sorts of reasons for this. The invention of the power loom, which meant that clothing was also much more widely available at lower prices. The invention of the steam engine. Here is Watt thinking up the steam engine, and there's his very first example in the British Museum. But look what it made possible. Roads, canals, steamships, railroads. And so suddenly people were able to get around their own nation, get around the globe much more rapidly. In 1804, the first locomotive, pictured there, could go 5 miles an hour. By 1830, it could go 16 miles an hour. By 1850, 50 miles an hour. And by that point, there were already 6,000 miles of track in Great Britain alone. And so the change in the way people lived, the way they moved around, the way they spent their time and where they lived was dramatic. Next time we'll start talking about the Industrial Revolution, and we'll play with George Bernard Shaw. Today we're going to be talking about George Bernard Shaw, who writes around the turn of the century and expresses a kind of cynicism that is somewhat surprising, given the history of the 19th century, and in particular the developments in the generation leading up to Shaw, which you might think would have made someone delighted with the condition of society. In Shaw and a variety of other figures around the turn of the century, it has exactly the opposite effect. So let me return to our discussion last time of developments in the 19th century, and that would lead us up to Shaw's situation. I mentioned that the agricultural revolution, starting around 1750, made food much more widely available than it had been before, and at much lower prices. That freed up people from the labor of the farms, enabled them to move to the cities, and also enabled a capital formation that allowed for the beginnings of industry. And so we saw by the middle of the century significant changes in the way people were living. Throughout the 19th century, 60% of the population moved from the farms into the cities. And the result was a vast growth in cities. In 1800, London had 1 million people, but there were no other cities in Great Britain over 100,000, and there were only 6 between 50 and 100,000. By the 1850, London had 2.4 million. 9 cities were between 100,000 and 1 million. 18 cities in the UK were over 50,000. And the same thing was happening all across Europe. Slightly delayed from what was happening in England, but not by much. So there was a tremendous movement throughout Europe from the farms to the cities. Now, life in the cities was not exactly great. People worked 12 to 16-hour days, 6 days a week. They dealt with noxious fumes, high temperatures, dangerous conditions. 2 of my great-grandfathers died in mills around the turn of the century in this country. Conditions were much worse, even a few decades earlier, in the mills in Europe. In fact, in one case, my grandfather was sent home because he was feeling faint and passed out. He was on his way home on an open-air streetcar, passed out, and fell off the streetcar and was hit by an oncoming bus, I think it was. In any case, the conditions in the mills were dangerous, and depictions in the time, in art and in photography, indicate that. That is turn of the century Pittsburgh. But the other side of that was that there were, for the first time in a long time, large numbers of people with discretionary income. People who actually had money to spend on things they wanted, as opposed to things they needed in order to survive. And that led to a tremendous change in the way society was organized. All of a sudden, people could think in terms of what they wanted, not just in terms of what they needed. And this was not just a small aristocracy, but a significant portion of the population. As the century went on, it was a larger and larger percentage of the population. Manufacturing, moreover, greatly increased productivity and lowered the cost of goods. A shirt was something that in the 1700s would have been immensely expensive. The average person could only have 1 or 2 sets of clothing, perhaps. Whereas by the dawn of the 20th century, clothing was being manufactured large scale, and it was becoming fairly inexpensive. People could have closets full of clothing. Now, the result of that meant that there was a tremendous growth in wealth in society and increased opportunities for trade, for travel. Now, the cities themselves were crowded. There was no plumbing in most of the cities, and that meant that, well, get 2.4 million people together in London with no plumbing, and you can imagine the health conditions, what it must have smelled like, what it must have been like: sewage in the streets, garbage in the streets, widespread disease. There you see a London slum in 1850 with yards, and then people crowded into the yards. Some lived in the houses, some lived in the yards, some lived in alleyways in between the houses. There was tremendous income inequality. The top 1% in 1801 had 25% of the national income in the UK. It was 35% by 1848, compared to about 19% today. Well, in the second half of the century, what happened is that the Industrial Revolution that had transformed things in the cities especially, but also on the farms and throughout industrialized societies, began to spread to a much larger subset of the population. So I've entitled it The Spread of Affluence. The first half of the 19th century could be described as the first Industrial Revolution. It's the one that brought about tremendous inequality. It's the one that created the factories, that made jobs possible, that made increased productivity possible, but also made conditions of life and labor very difficult. But then the second Industrial Revolution, starting around, that's supposed to be 1850 to 1900, that brought about a tremendous change and expanded the scope of this improvement in living conditions to a much larger set of the population. So it did a lot to alleviate the problems of the first Industrial Revolution. Right around the time the revolutions of 1848 occurred, there was a transformation as new industrial processes changed things and made it possible to produce many more goods at much lower prices. So what happened is that many more people ended up with discretionary income, not just a sort of small upper middle class, which was itself a great expansion from the aristocracy, but nevertheless, now it began to affect people in the middle. People began to think in terms of what they wanted, and the average person began to think that way, not just those in an elite. So there were new patterns of production, new patterns of consumption. This was an era of the growth of department stores. A lot of the main brands that we associate with products really arose during this part of the 19th century. There was dramatic population growth in Europe, 270 million to 460 million over the second half of the 19th century. Most of this was not really an increase in the birth rate, it was a question of declining death rates. And there were two major developments that made that possible. One of them was the advancement of medicine, and in particular the advent of the germ theory of disease. And the second part of it was the advent of plumbing. The introduction of plumbing into the cities made a huge difference. My grandfather was a plumber, and one time he told me, I think he was trying to convince me to take over the business, and he said, look, plumbers are the agents of civilization. Plumbers bring civilization to the cities. He brought it to parts of South Pittsburgh. And really, that's true. What makes it possible for large numbers of people to live in close proximity in the cities without getting sick? Well, the answer is plumbing to a large degree. And that's what happened over the second half of the 19th century. It made it possible for cities like London, Paris, Prague, Vienna to prosper without the plagues of cholera and other diseases that had swept through in the earlier parts of the 19th century. Now, the germ theory of disease seems to us almost commonsensical, but it was not at all common sense. It was the development of somebody who suffered greatly for his advance in medicine, especially the person on the left, Ignaz Semmelweis. He was a Hungarian physician working in Vienna. He was working in a hospital where there were two maternity wards, one on either end of the hospital, and the women in one of these wards died from childbirth at a much higher rate than the women in the other. Semmelweis was trying to figure out why. So he began to examine what people were doing in these two maternity wards. And he found out that one of them was next to the morgue. Doctors would perform autopsies and then would go in and deliver babies without ever washing their hands. And Semmelweis right away said, this is terrible, okay? Why don't we have the doctors wash their hands? And the way in which he does this it wasn't just soap and water. He didn't have good disinfectants to work with, so he had them wash their hands in lime. So it was highly costly. It was actually rather unpleasant for the doctors. But they did this, and the infection rates dropped dramatically. And he virtually eliminated this sort of childbirth fever that had been claiming so many women's lives. Now, what happened? Well, he realized that there were tiny things on your hands and really throughout the environment that caused people's illnesses. in short, that there were germs, bacteria, viruses, things that were causing people to get sick. And so he recommended what we would take to be elementary common sense precautions against this. What was astounding is at the time, this was thought to be crazy. People didn't believe him. He ended up being locked in an insane asylum. And within a short time of being there, he was beaten to death by one of the guards. Why? Because he kept insisting that everybody wash their hands. Like, there are these little tiny things over here, they're going to make you sick. Right? And if somebody did that now, right, they would say, oh, your body's just crawling with these tiny things, we're all going to get sick. Didn't think they were crazy. Well, that's the way they felt about him. Now, we think, well, in general, yeah, that's true, but we know enough to wash our hands, etc., etc. But at the time, that was new. And it led to a dramatic transformation. Before this, people died all the time from easily preventable infections. Louis Pasteur is the person who then generalized this and realized there were general methods for trying to avoid this. There's another image of Semmelweis, and here's one of Pasteur in his lab. Pasteur's work led in part to the process of pasteurization. Now our milk, lots of other products, are pasteurized, meaning that they're heated to a point that kills bacteria, kills off viruses. And that's something that made it possible for people to mass produce foods without generating illness. The transformation was tremendous. In 1750, only about a third of babies survived birth. By 1900, it was 85%. Now that's still rather low by our contemporary standards, but still, imagine 2/3 of children died in childbirth and about 1/4 of women died in childbirth in 1750. Now those are rather rare events. So it's a huge change in the way people have lived and the way people have died. A second feature of the second industrial revolution was a huge movement in populations, not simply from rural areas to urban areas within the same country, but between countries. It was an era of massive immigration. So yes, there was urbanization. 40% of the British population lived in cities. That's with a very loose definition of city. In 1800, by 1914, it was 80%. London, by 1900, had 6.5 million people. Only 100 years before, it had barely 1 million. And the number of European cities over 100,000 went from 21 to 147 over this century. So people all across the continent were moving into the cities. The same thing was happening in the United States, where partly due to population growth, partly due to immigration, the population of cities was increasing dramatically. The mustard-colored things you see there indicate population figures from 1850, and the pink population in 1900. So you can see the tremendous increases in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland. Chicago went from 25,000 people to a city of 1.7 million. St. Louis, Milwaukee, Detroit, and so on. There was huge population growth in the cities throughout this time, much of which was caused by immigrants coming to work in the factories in those cities. This is a shot of Ellis Island, where many of those immigrants from Europe came into the United States. Here are photographs from within Ellis Island of crowds being processed. Well, as you see, these go on and on. There's a wonderful historical site there, and one day I was going through these photographs and got all excited and thought, ooh, maybe some of these are my ancestors. In any event, you can see here, conditions were not always good. This is a New York City tenement. However, life in the United States in these factories was still better than what people had left behind. There was huge growth in the steel industry. As you can see, from 125,000 tons to over 32 million tons of steel being produced. And steel was also what drove the growth of a lot of cities in the United States. Cities like Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago. That's the only steel factory left in Pittsburgh, and now it's viewable from a roller coaster. So actually 2 roller coaster tracks that interweave there. Well, as you can see, I grew up near the steel mills, so I got lots of great shots of the steel mills, including some taken by Stanley Kubrick, like that photograph. And here is an indication that things did not always go well. That is a train accident in France where the train went off the rails and just went through a building. So there was a lot of danger associated with this. It wasn't just that people worked long hours in difficult conditions, but sometimes things badly went awry. Still, there was a huge growth in the chemical industry, for example, in pharmaceuticals, the development of electricity. There is the first electric power plant, just in New York City, that Edison created. Edison invented the light bulb after tens of thousands of attempts to find a filament that would work. You can still see in the Smithsonian all of his drawings and notebooks, and there are some of the early light bulbs. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, making communication possible much more easily than it had been before. You see here a telegraph machine, then a fancier one set up to look like a piano, and then, of course, the telephone. Marconi invented the radio. The 1880s and 1890s saw the development of the bicycle, and then the internal combustion engine. That's the first Ford motor car, 1896. And there's Henry Ford and his wife driving it. And then the Wright brothers and their first airplane at the dawn of the new century. Well, all of this technological advance meant that life was being transformed for large numbers of people. It also meant that people were much better off. Incomes were up 2 to 3 times across the board. The average income was up that much. Real wages had doubled by 1914 in Britain. People were working now about 5.5 10-hour days. They would work half a day on Saturdays. This was the era of the development of department stores, of large manufacturing plants, of consumer products. There's a department store that opened up in Berlin. Here is a street in Toronto. Here you see Paris. And you see the rise of a middle class, an affluent middle class that had really not been there before. So day-to-day life for a vast number of people was transformed. And you can see it in the art of the period. Here is someone, and look what she's doing. She's not working in the fields anymore. She's lying about in a pretty dress. Just sort of engaging in, I don't know, leisure. Now, along with all of this came a transformation in education. This was the time of the development of schools. People decided that in a democracy, the citizenry needed to be educated. Partly this was to participate in politics. Partly it was because people needed to be outfitted to work in factories. They needed some degree of education to be able to do that. Also, basically there was a religious element to instruction up to this time, and increasing mixtures of people made people think that it was important that education be secular and independent of the church. Finally, there was an attempt to inculcate in people the spirit of patriotism. You had people from all over the world coming into the country. It was most obvious in the United States, but it was happening in other countries too. People were coming in and crossing borders, and so there was an attempt to turn them into Americans or into Germans or whatever it was by creating a common culture in the schools. And so this was the advent of a period of mass education. And you see lots of photographs or artworks of the time of people in school. There are kids doing exercises in school, getting ready to engage in some hard reading and arithmetic. Here is a German pupil sitting at his desk. He's trying to pay attention, but you can see some of the people around him are not. In any case, literacy by the turn of the century, 1900, was now almost universal. There was a need for teachers that led to the creation of women's colleges to train teachers, and many state colleges and universities got their start this way. Yeah? Children still tended to work, but this was a time when child labor laws were beginning to come into, were beginning to be created and be enforced, precisely because, wait a minute, kids needed to be in school. So in 1850, it was commonplace for children to work in the factories or in the fields or do other things like that. By 1900, there was starting to be a sense that this was the wrong way for children to spend their time, and that they should be in school instead. And so the change wasn't really a sort of one-time change, it was gradual, and at this point, there was still some child labor, but not nearly as much as there had been 50 years earlier. You can see that this was a time of not only mass education, but mass newspapers, mass communications, magazines, the rise of popular culture that was distinct from the culture of an elite group. It was a time of music halls, team sports, theater productions, and so there were lots of effects of education. Here is the main reading room in the New York Public Library, created around this time. Here are women at a teacher's college. Here are women celebrating May Day at Bryn Mawr College now. And here are some of the popular entertainers around the turn of the century. The first World Series was played in 1903 between Boston and Pittsburgh. And there you see the crowd swarming the field after the game.